Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Druks Malan Unboxing. I am sitting here in lockdown, and this is part 2 of the heavyweights of the 90s. Now, in the first part, we talked about the really elite heavyweights of the 90s, who to me were Holyfield, Lewis, Bowe, and Mike Tyson. Now, let's talk about the sort of the next layer of heavyweights in the 90s. The guys who gave those guys hell in some instances, and who also had world titles of various kinds. Now, for one guy that had world titles at 2 occasions, he took the title from Evander Holyfield, who was the first southpaw heavyweight champion of the world, McCall. Now, in the first fight, he got up from a second round knockdown, and he outboxed Holyfield, mostly with his southpaw jab. Now, McCall, like Holyfield, was a very and Tyson for that matter in that era, was quite an undersized heavyweight. He started as a light heavyweight, where Holyfield was a cruiserweight more, and he won the WBO title there, and then moved up straight to heavyweight. Now, he gave us some very memorable fights. He won the WBO heavyweight title, which in that era wasn't considered such a big deal as it is now, but he fought a very, very memorable absolute wall against Bert Cooper. He looked like he was going out, and he stormed back to knock out Bert Cooper. Great heavyweight fight that. If you haven't seen it, you owe it to yourself to go watch McCall against Bert Cooper. And then he beat Holyfield for the title, and it didn't last long because he got knocked out by George Foreman. Now, in the 90s, we had the two old men. I mean it in a respectful way. They proved that boxing is not always a young man's game, and you can, in your 40s, if you're a truly great fighter, through knowing your own style and fighting to your advantages, you can actually compete quite successfully. And George Foreman did that by knocking out McCall in the 10th round after he was way behind. I remember it very well. These fights happened around about 4 a.m. In the morning here in South Africa, and I was lying in my bed and I was watching this fight, and I was one of a few who picked George Foreman to beat McCall, because he's more a flat-footed guy, and he's a small guy, and he hasn't got the greatest chin. That was my thinking. But throughout the fight, I thought Foreman would knock out Moore in the first 5 or so rounds. But Moore boxed really, really well. And then Foreman set him up with that right hand and planted him. And it was a tremendous moment, because nobody thought such a thing would be possible. I remember I started cheering in my bed, jumping up so hard I fell out of the bed onto the floor. And I was so excited about this, I ran to my girlfriend's house. And she wasn't a boxing fan, but she knew that was my thing. She gave me 2 sleeping pills to calm me down, and I had to sleep off the excitement of that fight. And Foreman then, I think he waited to get the Tyson fight that he never got. So, he was a bit lucky, in my opinion, to get the decision against Axel Schultz. Wouldn't fight the rematch. He didn't fight Tony Tucker, who was a WBA mandatory. So his belts got stripped from him, and he carried on fighting through that, And Foreman basically had some good wins against Louis Safaris, and his final fight was against Shannon Briggs, and Briggs became champion. And I think Foreman was very unlucky not to get the decision against Shannon Briggs. I had him winning that fight. So Foreman made an impact in the 90s. He was around, and even in his comeback that started in the 80s, but in the 90s he did some respectable wins over the likes of Jerry Cooney and the Brazilian Adilson Rodriguez, who looked good in those fights before fighting Holyfield. And in Holyfield, it was one of those good losses where the guy losing comes out of enhanced stature. He really put up a good show against Evander Holyfield. And before he beat McCall, he lost to Tommy Morrison. Everybody thought it was over. That made the Moore victory that much more special. Then the other old guy, we had Larry Holmes. Now Holmes, great fighter. I think the 80s belonged to Larry Holmes. He came back after having been stopped by Mike Tyson in the late 80s. And he came back to the ring, and we all thought it was going to be a disaster, because he hasn't got the power of a George Foreman. But he learned how to use all his tricks of a trade, and he scored that one great win against Ray Mercer, who was surging then, and nobody gave him a chance in hell. And he put a boxing lesson on Ray Mercer. I thought it was a great performance. He basically schooled him with a jab, with his back to the ropes in the corners, landed those rights on Mercer, and that got in a shot against Evander Holyfield. Poor Holyfield had to fight another 40-year-old, and he had to hear it from all corners. And I think Larry put up a very respectable performance against Holyfield, lost well enough. And he came back and he got another title shot later against Oliver McCall, who won the WBC title in a big upset. And he just lost by a couple of points. He almost could beat McCall, but there was just not enough zip in him. So a lot of people say Larry Holmes and George Foreman both had a career in their 40s. And Holmes actually did better. He just didn't win the title. Now we can debate whether that is not so or not. But Larry Holmes was a part of what made the 90s a special decade. And then we go to the upset kings that happened in the 90s. The decade was started with Buster Douglas knocking out Mike Tyson. And I've always wondered about Buster Douglas. He turned out to be a one-hit wonder. He could never reach that heights again. But there was nothing suggesting he was going to beat Tyson. He had losses on his record to guys like David Bay and Mike the Giant White. You know, guys who in South Africa got beaten by our local guys like Johnny de Pleur and Pierre Coetzee. He had those losses on his record, and in his previous title fight against Tony Tucker for a vacant belt, he was boxing really well. I watched that fight the other day, and then Tucker just opened up and got him out of there, stopped him on his feet. And so the logical thing would be Buster Douglas was a massive overachiever by beating Mike Tyson. It would have been a one-sided beatdown if it wasn't for that dramatic knockdown that Tyson scored that he got a long count for by referee Octavio Mairan. So that makes Tyson Douglas, if you've never seen it, a compelling fight to watch. Otherwise, it would have been a one-sided beatdown. But Tyson got him down there on the floor, and unlucky for him, it was a long count. But then Douglas went and stopped him. Now, was Buster Douglas an overachiever? Was he an underachiever? That's something that I always wondered about. The logical answer was he was a massive overachiever beating Tyson. But he was, in fact, I went back and I watched some of his fights. He was, in fact, a very good heavyweight that just he didn't do right by himself. He could have won the Tucker fight. He seemed to sort of lost interest and got stopped. He lost to guys he never should have lost against because he had the size, Buster Douglas. He had good movement. He was talented. He had reasonably quick hands. He had a nice jab. He had a lot of tools. He just struggled with staying in shape. If he had a Holyfield sort of work ethic, I think he could have done more in his career. But that's a matter for debate. Tell me what you think on the Buster Douglas issue. And then another big upset of the 90s was Oliver McCall, who came in and scored that one-punch stoppage of Lennox Lewis. I thought it was a tad early, the stoppage. I could be wrong. Lewis got up. He was wobbly. I thought it could have gone a little bit. But nevertheless, McCall came out of nowhere. He was another guy who couldn't get over the hump. He lost to guys like comebacking Tony Tucker, Orlin Norris, a small heavyweight, who became a cruiserweight champion later. But then he put together a nice string of wins, culminating with a win against Francesco Damiani, very underrated Italian, who was an Olympic silver medalist. Broke Damiani's nose and got the stoppage, very much like Ray Mercer did. And he got his shot against Lennox Lewis, and he put him down with one shot, got the stoppage, made a successful title defense against Larry Holmes. He had to scramble to do it, and then he lost the title to Frank Bruno, and what I think was quite a mild upset at the time. Brings me to Frank Bruno. He's also worth a mention among those 90s, just for the human interest story of it. I always was a fan of Bruno. Yes, he had his limitations. When he opens up, you could catch him with a counter shot, and that would freeze him and lead to a stoppage. If he could go the rounds, he did against Pierre Coetzee and against Carl Williams. But if he was in against a really elite heavyweight that could push him all the way, he would start to gas like he did there at the end against Oliver McCall. But he learned how to survive. He learned how to hold and to survive those rocky spots against McCall. He had a very good jab. He had power on both hands. He always fought sort of the same way, so he was quite predictable. But he had a lot of heart. He tried his best, and I was very happy for him when he finally got the title in his fourth try. That's Frank Bruno. And then we had a couple of other heavyweights that never quite got over the really big hump, but one of them, Ray Mercer, did win the WBO title for a very memorable war against Bert Cooper. I've never seen a guy busted up so bad winning a fight quite clearly, like Ray Mercer did that night, because he kept bringing it to Cooper, and Cooper would hit him with a massive power shot, a couple of power shots every round almost, although he didn't win enough rounds. Mercer won easily on points, but his face was swollen like a balloon, so he had a lot of heart when he was on his game. And then against Tommy Morrison, he took some hellacious shots before turning it around and knocking out Tommy Morrison. And then against Larry Holmes, he got taken to school, came back with a couple of wins. And then against Jesse Ferguson, he was also on the wrong side of a massive upset and blew a title shot there. But he did hold the WBO title, and he did go back and he gave Evander Holyfield all he could handle. And he gave Lennox Lewis a very, very tough fight and lost a close decision there. And he managed to score a win over Tim Witherspoon after that, although I thought he was a little bit lucky with a decision against Tim Witherspoon. But Ray Mercer was also something that made the 90s compelling. And if we talk about chins, you know, people say Ray Mercer had a chin like an anvil, and he did. But Holyfield put him down. The best chin in the 90s to me belonged by far to Oliver McCall. He was never off his feet. He had that stoppage loss to Lennox Lewis, but that was because he had a mental breakdown and wasn't off his feet there. So he was a mainstay of Mike Tyson's sparring as well. Nobody, to the best of my knowledge, have been able to knock Oliver McCall off his feet, and he had even quite some success fighting into his 40s, beating the Turkish guy Sinan Samuel Sam in an upset. So best chin of the 90s goes to Oliver McCall for me, for close seconds Ray Mercer. But then we also had Tommy Morrison. He's also a bit of an in and outer, but he made the 90s exciting. I mean, he failed in his first title shot against Ray Mercer, excuse me, but he gave Mercer quite a few shots. Then he picked himself up. He caused a mild upset. I think Foreman was a favorite by changing his style, boxing on his feet in and out pointing George Foreman. Before that, he also gave us some really good wars where he was hurt and he came back for it against Carl Williams, got over canvas twice, I think. Against Joe Hip, he also had to walk through fire to win that fight. So he was an exciting fighter. He's a guy who had talent, he had a big punch, and not such a great chin, and not the most durable guy. And he also gave us a very nice little war against Razor Ruddock, got off a canvas there to win as well. And then of course he couldn't beat Lennox Lewis. That was just a different level. But Tommy Morrison was also a guy that made the 90s exciting. So I would go in, if we look at the B, just under the elite, the two older guys, Foreman, Larry Holmes, Michael Moore, who also got the IBF title back, beating Axel Schultz for the vacant belt, fought a very memorable war against Francis Botha, our own Francois Botha of the White Buffalo. He was given hell by Botha and eventually turned it around and stopped Botha. So Moore was also part of the mix, you know. We never saw him against really big guys like Lennox Lewis and Riddick Bowe, but Moore, along with Tommy Morrison and Ray Mercer, were also part of what made these 90s a great decade. So that's it from me today. I'll do a third installment on the 90s about the sort of lower rung contenders and gatekeepers that gave us some good fights. But until then, remember to keep those hands up.